If we're not going to have a quiz tonight because the lessons were due from our MiDA guys, we're going to introduce this a little bit different. It gives me an opportunity, since we're halfway through the book, if someone were to ask you to, in just a few brief statements, describe the book of Hebrews, how would you do that? I know this is catching you kind of cold, but we've been in here for a while.
A warning letter written to the Jews.
Yeah.
Okay, a warning letter written to
The Jews, primarily.
Okay, okay, I can go with that. I
would probably expand and say the Christian Jews that have heard the word, accepted Jesus, and been baptized and started the walk, is the warning is that you're going to drift away and go back to the old way they were thinking, that to go back to the law.
Yeah.
Don't go back to the old way. Warning after warning, like you said. You're going to fall away. Let's not do that. I know you're not going to, but I'm going to tell you, don't do it.
Yeah, right. That's good. That's good. Would you word it any different? Any other? How would you present it if somebody were asking you what's the book of Hebrews all about? That's great, by the way. I like the way you put it there. Yeah.
I'd say it shows us how Jesus is the only person that can save us.
Yes.
How he's greater than, he's the greatest. I try to say something along the lines of like, how he's greater than any other system that can save you. And if you ever fall away from that, or if you ever ignore that, or don't rely on that, then you can't be saved.
Perfect. And if I combine those two, I would say any other system, specifically the Old Covenant system, the system that the Jews had under the Old Testament. Yeah, good. Okay, with that in mind, any other additions or any other comments that you would make if you were introducing this to somebody and they wanted to know, hey, what's this book of Hebrews all about? Okay, I know you're thinking it on the inside. So okay. How does this character Melchizedek, this historical character Melchizedek, how does he play into the book of Hebrews? Let's take it from a broad perspective like that. If one of the main points of the book of Hebrew, which by the way I think the main point of the book of Hebrews is to compare the Old Covenant to the New, and show that as great as the Old Covenant was, it was only foreshadowing and looking forward to the New Covenant, which is the only covenant that gets us right with God. And so the premise here is that anybody who gives up on this new covenant, especially to go back to the old covenant, or for any other reason for that matter, you have lost the only hope that you've got, because that's the only one that works. Now, with that basic idea, why bring up the man Melchizedek, and how does he play into this overall theme of the book of Hebrews?
He's the type of priesthood that God always intended through his son Jesus.
Okay. He is the priest that gets us ready for and foreshadows the one true priest. We have a foreshadowing in the priesthood of the Old Covenant, but we have even a better foreshadowing in this Melchizedek. He shows us some unique qualities that we're going to find in Jesus that were inadequate in the priesthood of the Old Covenant, in the Old Testament. And so Melchizedek becomes a key person to better understand Jesus as our high priest. In who he is, it emphasizes the fact that it's not a matter of ancestry, it's not a matter of genealogy, it's not a matter of anybody else. And in Jesus' case, it foreshadows the fact that Jesus is going to be eternal. He is not like any other person. He has no end. He blessed Abraham. And what's the significance of him blessing Abraham?
The greater blesses.
The greater blesses the lesser. And in this case, if Melchizedek blesses Abraham, Abraham is significant to Israel because he's the father of this nation. And to follow the line of reasoning in the book of Hebrews, if he were to bless Abraham, then in a sense he's not just showing superiority to Abraham, he's showing superiority to anyone who would come from Abraham. In fact, he comes right out and says the other thing where Abraham pays the tithe to Melchizedek. What did that signify? Why was that important? It's just the other way around. If the greater blesses the lesser gives the tithe to the greater. And he uses this line of reasoning. If Abraham did that, paid the tithe to Melchizedek, then in essence, so did Levi, so did everyone who came after Abraham. They are in essence paying the tithe to Melchizedek, showing he's the superior one. So the picture here of one who is superior, one who goes beyond the limitations of the human system, that's a great picture of what we've got in Jesus. And so he's going to, we just started this, he's going to further develop this as we go through the rest of the 7th chapter. I think we're down to around, didn't we finish verse 10?
Yes.
Okay. Let's pick up reading then in verse 11. He says, so if the priesthood of Levi, and when we talk about it was the tribe of Levi that the priest came from, right? Okay. To be a high priest, though, you had to be a descendant of which person?
Aaron.
Okay, so sometimes we're going to refer to this as the Levitical priesthood, because you had to be a part of the tribe. Sometimes I'll mess up and I'll say Aaronic, but what I mean by that is a descendant of Aaron to be the high priest, mean the same thing. I'm talking about the priesthood under the Old Covenant. Does that make sense in case I go in and out of the terminology here? We're talking about the Old Covenant, the system of law, which by the way, if we can just get this in our mind's eye very simplistically, I always remember a theology class with Dr. Jack Cottrell. He was so good at just making it as simple as possible. He says, if you want to picture the Old Covenant, you can picture this giant staircase going up to heaven with this sign on it. Here it is. Here's the law system. All you have to do is keep the laws and you avoid the punishment. Break the laws, you suffer the punishment. Sounds fair. It sounds right because it is right and it is fair. That's a legal system, right? So if you keep that in mind as far as the Old Covenant system, we'll come back to that, okay? It's just living by the standard, living by the law that God has given. So if the priesthood of Levi on which the law was based, I know this seems like just such a simple phrase, but he's been comparing Melchizedek to Levi, right? Mm-hmm. And the reason he's doing that is he's going to show that Jesus is not like the Levitical priesthood. He's going to be patterned after, he's going to be like Melchizedek. So it's a whole new system, right? Well, he's comparing priesthood, but he's in this verse he starts to slip something else in that he really wants to address. And that's this. I'm not just talking priesthood. I'm talking about the whole shebang. What he means by that is the entire Old Covenant. Covenant would be contract, relationship, testament, agreement between God and man, the law system. He says here, if the priesthood of Levi on which the law was based. In other words, if there's a problem with the priesthood of the Old Testament law, then you know what that means?
The Old Testament as a whole.
See, we got a problem with the whole Old Testament law. Because how does the Old Testament law work? Well, it works because when you do these things, here's the priest. Well, what happens if, that doesn't work? Well, then that means this doesn't work. Are you following me? He's introducing this to tie it together. He's not just talking about the priesthood. He wants to bring up the whole system, which is so important because this is the system these guys are tempted to go back to. Right? You can't take them apart. Okay, so if the priesthood of Levi, on which the law system is based, if it could have achieved perfection, and the word for perfection here, do you have a different word in your translation? Is it perfection? Perfection. Okay, that's fine. It's the idea, though, of completion or making things right. In other words, if this staircase, if we had a system where everybody could keep all the laws and not break the laws, then wow, that staircase would take us all the way to God, right? And we'd be okay with it. He said, if it could have achieved perfection, if it could have made us right the way God intended, why did God need to establish a different priesthood? You know, if this one's working, then why do you need a different one? He says, with a priest in the order of Melchizedek instead of the order of Levi and Aaron. Okay, you understand Levi's the tribe and Aaron would be the high priesthood. So he's saying that the same thing. He's talking about that whole system. But notice he introduced here, we're not just talking about Melchizedek because the priest didn't work. We're talking about Melchizedek and an entire new system because the priesthood is tied to the law. And so if that whole thing is found inadequate, then we're not just talking, okay, you didn't do your job well enough, so we're going to replace you and put him in here. No, we're talking about a new priest and a whole new job description, a whole new system. Yeah, a whole new thing. Okay, in verse 12, and if the priesthood is changed, the law must also be changed to permit it. So he introduced it in verse 11. He's coming back a little stronger in verse 12, saying these two are tied, and so it's going to have to bring a whole new system. For the priest that we are talking about belongs to a different tribe whose members have never served at the altar as priests. Okay, which tribe did Jesus belong to?
Judah.
He's from the tribe of Judah. Which tribe do the priests belong to?
Levi.
Tribe of Levi. So if Jesus were supposed to be serving as a priest, because, hey, we've got Jesus, he's perfect, so why don't we just plug him into the old covenant? Well, you can't do that.
No.
Why? Because he doesn't fit the requirements of the old covenant. He's from the wrong tribe. So people who might be tempted to think, oh man, we love the old covenant, we'll just take Jesus too. Oh, it doesn't work that way. Does this make sense? You can't plug them into that. One of the analogies that I really like, that because we're talking specifically Jews who are tempted to go back to the old covenant, but I want us to see that this applies to anything. It doesn't have to be Jew, Old Testament, Old Covenant relationship. This applies to anything other than Jesus, and that's where I like this analogy. People bring up this picture, this analogy of there's a bunch of different pathways up the same mountain. I bet you everybody's heard that one, right? You Christians, you think you have the only pathway up the mountain, right? And when they talk that way, sometimes, deep down it bothers us because we know, John the 14th chapter, I'm the way, the truth, the life. Mm-hmm. No man comes to the Father but by me. And so we're kind of like saying, well, yeah, sorry. Only one pathway, and we don't mean to offend them. And the problem with this is we've bought into their analogy. And what I understand this to say, what I really like about this is I think the correct answer is not to say, yeah, we have the only pathway up the mountain. I think the correct answer is saying, we've got a whole new mountain. Because what people, whether they say it or not, what they really mean when they talk I don't know what people really mean. What most people mean when they say this is they say, you guys think you're the only good people. Don't you realize there are good Buddhists and there are good Jehovah's Witnesses and there are good, whatever. There's a whole bunch of other good people. And you're looking down off the end of your nose saying, no, they're not as good as we are. No, if you're talking, because the presumption here is being good enough and working through and living a good life. If you're talking about being a good person, working your way up, listen, the Christian living as best he can doesn't make it up the mountain. The mountain of being good enough doesn't work. And yeah, there are a whole bunch of pathways on that mountain. And by the way, there is a pathway called the law that reads all the way to the top and can make it to God, and potentially it can get you there. The only problem is if you ever sin, then you've blown that pathway. But there is a pathway that goes all the way to God on this mountain, right? And there's a whole bunch of different ways to be good. But what we're saying is, we need a whole new mountain. And this whole new mountain is one where Jesus has gotten us right with God. So, I don't know, to me that fits in with what we're talking about here. Because it's over against this idea of trying to be good enough as represented by the law. Verse 13. We just read that because he doesn't come from the tribe of Levi. He comes from He comes from the tribe of Judah. Verse 14, what I mean is, our Lord, I love this. He says, what I mean is, our Lord came from the tribe of Judah, and Moses never mentioned priests coming from that tribe. Okay, that verse seems a little redundant, doesn't it? Didn't he just say that in verse 13? Mm-hmm. But he said something extra neat here. And the reason he repeats this phrase in my translation where it says he came from the tribe of Judah, what does yours say?
Descended.
He descended. Okay. It's not the word for being descended. It's not the word for coming from. It's not the word for being born into. This is a word, if you translated it as literally as you possibly could, you would say he sprung forth.
King James says arose from.
Okay, that's pretty close, because you usually don't think about people springing forth. Usually you think of vegetation springing forth, right? You think of people descending or being born. Well, why is this so neat? Are any light bulbs coming on from Old Testament prophecies? Do you remember one of the I don't have a marker right there.
I was thinking about that.
I was going to draw you a picture.
Stump.
Picture this big stump, yeah.
That's what I was picturing.
Yeah, because a picture in the Old Testament, one of the most used phrases is what? What's Jesus, the Messiah, referred to as?
Seed.
The shoot. So if you picture a big stump of a tree that's been chopped down, then you've got a little sprig just shooting back forth. Sometimes some translations call them the branch.
The branch of David.
Which is really inadequate, because the word shoot fits much better, because it's the picture of starting all over again. So what would the tree stump, the tree that chops down, what does that represent?
The Old
The
Testament.
Old Testament. Or
Okay, be a little more specific, because this is in the Old Testament.
Law.
pre-Jerusalem, before
Okay,
the wrath.
specifically in most of the Old Testament prophecies, it represents the line of David. Because the line of David, you look at the kings and the succession of kings, and what happens to the line of David? It's like, boom, chopped off. Well, wait a minute. I thought our hope was supposed to come from the line of David. And it looks like he's gone. Did Jesus come from the line of David? Yeah, he did. And so it's kind of like when the kingdom comes to an end and it's cut off, everybody's like, we're losing hope. What's going to happen to this? And the prophets kept saying, oh yeah, but like the shoot that comes out, he will reappear. He'll come out of that. But it's the line of David from the tribe of Judah, right? You know what word he uses here? He uses that same word because he's talking to people, know the Old Covenant really well, and they're gonna have this picture. Yeah, the Messiah springs forth from the line of David, right? So it ties in the messianic prophecies that were made there. Verse 15, this change has been made very clear since a different priest who is like Melchizedek has appeared. What change? The change that we no longer have the tribe of Levi and the law system it's built on. That one's inadequate, right? So we've got a brand new system. It's another way it's being emphasized is it's from the line of Judah, and it's in the likeness of Melchizedek. Verse 16, Jesus came as a priest, not by meeting physical requirements. What physical requirements would he have had to have met under the Old Covenant?
Born under Levi. Yeah.
Aaron.
Born from the
Okay, would have had to been from the tribe of Levi.
and from Aaron.
Aaron.
It would have had to be a descendant of Aaron
Right.
if he were high priest. That's exactly right. Belonging to the tribe of Levi. So he didn't meet those physical requirements. He didn't have to meet those physical requirements. What requirement did he meet? The power of a life that cannot be destroyed. What does your translation say?
Indestructible.
Indestructible.
Okay, indestructible.
And
Okay, when you think of indestructible or cannot be destroyed, or what was the phrase you had, Rob?
Power of an endless life.
Endless. Okay, endless. The idea of eternal. In fact, he's going to go with this in just a minute. He's going to say that the priests under the tribe of Levi, you know what? We've had a whole bunch of them. Why? Because they don't last forever. You know, they keep handing off the baton, right? And he said, verse 17, and the psalmist pointed this out. Now, this is about the third time already in the book. The book of Hebrews. He has quoted the Old Testament several times, but this is about the third time where he's quoting Psalms for a specific reason, because there's an understanding, and we get this from a lot of the Jewish literature around the time of the first century. There's an understanding that was prevalent that he wants to cut against. Remember we had this the first time when we were talking about the rest that God had promised? And he said it wasn't just a rest talked about in the wilderness experience, the psalmist also talked about that. And remember, he's jumping forward hundreds of years in history to show them that it was never fulfilled. And so he's jumping forward in history. Here, he's jumping forward in history because one of the things that the Jews taught was, Melchizedek was a priest. I mean, he's there in Genesis, the 14th chapter, and they taught him. They taught him about that because he's in the Bible. But they said he had to be inferior to Levi. Why? Because Levi came later. That was their line of reasoning. And so he's saying, okay, let's not just see what Genesis say about that. Let's go to the psalmist. Why? Because the psalmist came way after the law was delivered. And so we're going to be making some points here, not just from the Old Testament quotation when Melchizedek was here. Let's go after the fact, because understanding that some of you guys think whatever comes later as which, by the way, my understanding is that's the way, what's the sacred book of Islam? Quran. That's the way, because the Quran, when you find two different, they don't call them chapters. What do they call them? Yeah, that's what they call them. When you read those things that contradict, they always go with the later one.
Right.
So this one takes precedence over that one because, new and improved, right? Okay, for those who would follow or would be tempted to go with that line of reasoning, he's going to address it here simply by quoting the psalmist, right? And so when he quotes the psalmist, what does he say? This is from the psalmist. He says, "You are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek." Could have said that anywhere, but isn't that interesting that he says that? God says that after the Levitical priesthood is up and running. In fact, he said it while the Levitical priesthood is up and running. Okay, verse 18, yes, the old requirement about the priesthood was set aside. Again, I'm interested in your translations here, because this is a legal term. It literally means an annulment.
That's what it says here, annulling.
Annulling. Why, you're using New King James or Old King James?
New King James.
New King James. I'm impressed.
American Standard is disannulling.
Does New American Standard have annulling as well?
Is disannulling.
Okay.
That's funny. Mine does not.
He's not just saying it was set aside. He chooses a legal term to describe this because he wants them to know, hey, we're talking about, remember, we're not just talking about priesthood, we're talking about the law. So he says, let's use some legal terms that meet the law's requirements to talk about this. And he says, according to the law, this is null and void. Superseded, set aside. Okay, let me just go ahead and say it. What? I'm just trying to get us to see what the Hebrew author is saying here, and it seems a little redundant. It's not, because he's bringing out little nuances as he goes through, but sometimes things are repeated for emphasis' sake. Sometimes things are repeated because we need to hear them a whole bunch of times so we can get it across. And I'm thinking it wasn't just the Jews who were tempted to go back to the Old Covenant who need to hear this several times. I think a lot of people need to hear this today, because there are some people, I don't know if you know this or not, there are some people who think that the temple is going to be rebuilt in Jerusalem and there's going to be sacrifices offered once again. Well, nobody told the Hebrew author that, because the term he uses here is not put on hold. No. It's done away with. And he doesn't just say that in passing. He says it again and again. And he's not just talking about priesthood. He's talking about the whole law system. So when somebody brings up this idea that the sacrifices are going to start again and everything, it more than bothers me. That's offensive. Because what does that say about Jesus' sacrifice? Jesus is the one and only sacrifice that took care of everything. So I just want you to be prepared. I think the book of Hebrews really needs to be studied in light of, not just this, in light of today's, can I just use the word goofy? Is that okay? Will you guys forgive me if I say goofy views that people have about, if you are a Jew, you have a special status with God. The Old Covenant was only put on hold for a while and it still is binding. Any of those kind of ideas, I just don't see how you, most of the New Testament, but especially the book of Hebrews, I don't see how you can get that. But let's keep going, because he's going to make this point again and again. Verse 18, yes, the requirements of the Old Testament priesthood were set aside, were annulled, because it was weak and useless. Wow, that's pretty potent, isn't it?
Yeah.
If it doesn't work,
Unprofitableness.
okay. If it doesn't work, put it on the side of the road, buy a new one. Look at verse 19. For the law, he was just talking about the priesthood. Why is he talking about the law?
Because they're connected.
Thank you. For the law never made anything perfect.
Wow.
Okay, let's push pause for just a second here. If the law never made anything perfect, then we've already talked about this, and I know you know this, but if the law never made anything perfect, then how were people saved in the Old Testament? How were their sins forgiven? How did that happen?
Waiting for
They
the
were
Messiah to
waiting
forgive
because
them for
of-
their sins.
Because of what Jesus is going to do in the future.
Right.
That's the only way. Our sins are forgiven because what Jesus did in the past. Their sins were forgiven because what Jesus was going to do in this future. It was not because they killed a lamb or they killed a bull and they took the blood in. He's going to make that very clear. That never did it. That was a shadow looking, a foreshadowing, a type looking forward to something that was going to happen, that was going to forgive sins. It was Jesus. That's what he's trying to get him to see, Chris.
I wish I knew, but is this the book that talks about how people felt unsatisfied?
Yes! He's going to get over in chapters 9 and 10. He's going to talk about the conscience.
Okay.
I love that one because you know, if you're a serious, I know there's always people that just kind of go through the motions, but if you're sincere and serious and you really want to be right with God and you're following the old covenant and you've killed a little lamb and you're like, okay, I'm doing this because God told me to do it, but you're still scratching your head like, how does this get me right with God? How does that take care of the fact that I lied? How does that take care of the fact of, you know what I mean? So the conscience of people under the Old Testament, but were never fully satisfied in and of itself. It's because it foreshadowed something that was coming. It's tied with the Messianic hope, yeah.
That's following God, not based on your feelings, isn't it?
Yeah.
Big
Yeah.
time.
Yeah.
That's cool.
Good stuff. Good stuff. Okay. The law never made anything perfect, but now we have a confidence of a better hope through which we can draw near to God. This system actually works. This new system, this new covenant, this new relationship that we've got with Christ as our high priest. Verse 20, this new system was established with a solemn oath. Okay, we've already run into this term. Remember when God made the promise to Abraham, he didn't just make a promise, he took an oath. What's the difference between a promise and an oath?
Swear by something greater.
Okay, say that again, because
You swear by something greater. than
yes, you do
yourself.
swear by something greater. But remember,
But it's
when he's talking about
binding.
Abraham, he didn't just make the promise, he also gave him an oath. Remember the difference between those two? I mean,
The oath comes with a, what's the word? Consequence if you don't keep it.
okay.
Yeah, in this case.
There is some of that tied to it because the oath was, again, a legal term, and it meant the idea of guaranteeing. A guarantor, it's based on somebody who, if you don't come through with it, they're the ones going to pay. So God didn't have to. In the sense, it's kind of redundant. He made a promise and he took an oath. Well, one, I said I'm going to do it. Another one, I'm tying myself to this. I'm legally binding myself to this. So it has the legal quality to it. Well, this idea of guaranteeing, of underwriting, right? That this is really going to work. This new system is established with that. It has God's guarantee associated with it. Aaron's descendants became priests without such an oath. Do you get the significance of this? The whole Old Testament system, was that God's design? Yes, it was God's design. And part of the reason for this is to help us better understand what's really going to happen in the future. But it never was established with the promise, with the guarantee of God. By the way, this really works and this will get you right with God. Yes, this is what you're supposed to do. Yes, this is what God requires. But he never said, this is it and this is what gets you right with God. Because it was even under the best of conditions when it was first set up. That's not what the purpose of it was. The purpose of it was to point us to the one system that would make us right with God. So there's no solemn oath. There's not this guarantee associated with Aaron's system, but there was an oath regarding Jesus. For God said to him, the Lord has taken an oath and will not break his vow. You are a priest forever. Okay? This is like the third time he's quoted this. You are a priest forever. Who's that referring to? Jesus. But it's based on the guy we're talking about, Melchizedek, as a foreshadowing, as an analogy, as a metaphor, as a picture of what we get in Jesus. Verse 22, because of this oath, Jesus is the one who, in my translation, this is where it really comes out. Jesus is the one who guarantees this better covenant with God. Okay, this better covenant with God, the end of verse 22. It's not diatheke. It's not the normal word for covenant. Again, this is really interesting to me because this is the typical word that you use. Because a covenant, what do you usually think of with covenant? Broad sense of the term, a covenant is a contract. Contract. This word, by the way, both these words can be translated covenant, and that's fine. But this word is the word you use if you specifically want to talk about last will and testament. So this is the one that you use specifically when you're talking about a will. Okay, is a will a contract, by the way?
Yes.
Sure it is. But it's a specific kind of will, contract, right? And that's it. So looking at that, he says, this is guaranteed. What is guaranteed? This will and testament we've got with God. Oh, this is just so neat because
Inheritance.
yeah, because what is the new covenant? The new covenant is Jesus as the high priest who offers the perfect sacrifice, which, by the way, he's not only the high priest, he's the sacrifice. And by the way, what has to happen to the sacrifice? Has to die. When he dies, the will goes into effect. That's why you don't just call it a relationship, you call it a will, because the death of the one who made the will now goes into. Do you see how these terms tie together, dovetail so well? Verse 23. There were many priests under the old system. This is so interesting to me personally, because if you read Josephus, he'll give you one number. If you read the Talmud, they give you another number. There were a lot of priests, and evidently they had a hard time tracking them. And which, by the way, you know, one of the reasons they had a hard time tracking the number of priests? This is a point of confusion sometime when you're reading in the New Testament, because when Jesus goes through his trials, and you talk about the priest and the high priest at that time, and then when you get to the book of Acts and you read the high priest, it's kind of like, hey, wait a minute, what's going on here? And what's going on is, in the Old Testament, when somebody became a high priest, that was supposed to last their lifetime. But in New Testament times, that's no longer what was happening.
Yeah.
Now it was only for it was a very political thing, and it was usually controlled by different households. But they would pass off the high priest position to somebody else, and it would come and go. And so the numbering got mixed up, and I don't want to bore you with the details here, but we can't land on a certain number, and it's of no consequence, because the point he's making is you had a bunch of them. Yeah.
Wait, so them doing that, passing the position off,
Yes.
was not intended by God, right?
Well, yeah. Well, you know, most of the priests, when you think of the priesthood in the New Testament, what do you usually associate that with? Do you associate it with Pharisees or Sadducees when you think of priests in the New Testament?
Pharisees usually.
Not the Pharisees. So I guess that leaves us with Sadducees. Okay. And what do you know about the Sadducees? The Sadducees came and asked Jesus some questions. Remember the question they said?
They don't believe in resurrection.
They don't believe in resurrection.
That's
Wait a minute. These are the guys who are responsible for representing people to God, and they don't believe in an afterlife. I would have a problem with this if I were going to that kind of church. In fact, I'll tell you, I've probably already told you this story. Yeah, I've got a friend. You've seen my truck. I've got this M&M acoustics thing. I do 2 or 3 jobs a year because I enjoy that stuff, just kind of on the side. And so I'm associated with this man who got me into this company. He's my dealer rep. I've got one dealer rep. Anyway, and I talk to him once every other year. Anyway, he is church-going, Bible-studying, good fella. And I've enjoyed some conversations I've had with him. In fact, when we sit down to talk about my business, we spend 90% of our time talking about the Bible and church. And, oh yeah, I've got this product for you, Mark. Anyway, his stories. He was telling me, hey, I was in Merritt Island not too long ago. This is a few years back. He said, because I was going to a funeral. And he said, at the funeral, I talked to the guy from the church who was in charge of this. And I don't want to give it away. But he said, I happen to know this guy because of some business relationships. And so he's talking to him afterwards, and he says, yeah, I don't believe in any of this stuff. He doesn't believe in God, doesn't believe in an afterlife, but he makes good money working at this church. And so if I ever know anybody going to that church, I'm gonna anyway. But if I were a temple goer in the New Testament, I have a real problem with the priesthood. Because of that. How did I get way off on that? Sorry. Yeah, Chris and then Roger.
Didn't the high priest have to go in once a year to make
Yes.
atonement? Wouldn't he die if like his sins weren't atoned for or whatever before he walked in? Like, didn't he have to do some procedures?
Yeah.
Yeah, but already by the time the New Testament comes around, there have already been some major changes in that whole system.
So does that mean that?
Because
The Ark of the Covenant is not in the temple anymore.
that's exactly right.
Oh, so that's why they wouldn't.
You know,
die.
we've got the synagogue system that was established in the intertestamental period.
Right.
So a lot of that has already changed by the time you get to the New Testament. But perverted, yeah, it was perverted.
So was it even God's priesthood? I mean,
Well,
There's some evidence
Yeah.
that it was not always adhered to. When I was reading, it sounded like, because they were having a problem right after the restoration of Jerusalem and the temple, Nehemiah had to come back and clean house again because they were already messing up. They were appointing priests that weren't supposed to be.
and by the way, what did Nehemiah say when people couldn't trace their lineage back? They kicked him out.
Hey, that's right.
If they couldn't do it, Nehemiah said, hey, this is a requirement, and you've got to be able to show your lineage. If you can't do it, you know, you may really be an ancestor, but I'm sorry, you can't prove it, you're out.
But 400
Nehemiah
years,
was a good man. He's trying to clean house, trying to do it the right
400
way.
years go by, you can imagine what happened in the short time Nehemiah was there. It didn't work.
Oh, there was
You know.
a lot of problems. Roger.
Oh, I was just going to say, in Acts where Paul used that resurrection with the Pharisees and the Sadducees.
Yes!
He used that.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. To get out of trouble when he was with the Sanhedrin, he's like, I'm here because I believe in the resurrection.
Yeah.
Throw that grenade in the middle of the mix and see what happens. That's exactly right, Roger. Good point. Because the Pharisees, for all their legalism, they were very, very much concerned about trying their best to, well, a lot of them were concerned about the externals, but there were some guys like Nicodemus who obviously more concerned about the externals. He really wanted to live a godly life. And so the Pharisees, you were much more likely to get people to have that conservative, what does God say? And the Sadducees were not like that. And that's what the priesthood was associated with. Okay, there are many priests under the old system. This is verse 23. For death prevented them from remaining in office, but because Jesus lives forever. Now do you understand why he emphasized the idea that there's no ancestry associated with Melchizedek? Not because Melchizedek lived forever, but that's a point that he wanted us to see was realized in Jesus, right? So foreshadowing of something that was really true with Jesus. He's a priest that lasts forever. Verse 25, therefore he is able once and forever to save. Some translations say save completely, which, by the way, is a real good translation. Save completely those who come to God through him. He lives forever to intercede with God on their behalf. There's a lot in this verse. This once and forever idea he's going to come back to because it's such a significant point. In fact, in chapter 9, he's going to say, if Jesus didn't do this once for all, the only alternative would be for him to constantly be dying since the creation of the world to take care of sins. Why? Because he'd have to die for every single sin. That's your only alternative, to die every time there's a sin or to do it once for all and cover all sins. And since he was infinite, he could die once and cover all. So he's going to come back to that point about doing it once for all. But this idea of saving completely. The New Testament, there are several words, and we've talked about them at different times. And by the way, these are, some words, there's some vocabulary where it's kind of like, I don't appreciate the fact when people use vocabulary just to impress other people. That's unfortunate, I think. But there's some vocabulary that is very important. And in the New Testament, there's a word, and it's justification, to be justified. And it's a very important word to understand because it's a legal term. And I'm pretty confident most of you already know what this means. To be justified means legally your sins have been taken care of. So it's a legal term, and it means that you're no longer held accountable. You're no longer guilty. You've been justified. You've been made right. But there's a separate term that the Bible uses in talking about our sins, and it says there's sanctification. In sanctification, there's two different aspects of sanctification. There is a sanctification that happens instantaneously at one time, and then there's a sanctification that is a process that is ongoing. If you think of justification, justification as a legal forgiveness of sins, so that it's no longer on your rap sheet, so to speak, sanctification is an actual dealing with the problem of sin in our lives. And the reason there's two different aspects to sanctification is that we were made alive. We weren't just forgiven. We were taken out of death and made alive when we became Christians. So there is this sense of, sometimes the Bible talks about regeneration, this made alive. And it's also an idea of an instantaneous, one-time sanctification. We were brought into the family. But there's also a sense in which there's an ongoing, uncorrupting, so to speak, where I get better and better. I don't get more and more forgiven. I'm 100% forgiven. I'm justified when I become a Christian. But the process, and I'm also joined the family and become part of God's family, but there's a process that starts too. And it's saying, why am I going into all this? Because he says we get the whole deal. We get everything we need when we're saved. We don't just get forgiven. We get justified. We get sanctified in both sense of the terms. In fact, there's, again, Dr. Cottrell used, in one class I was sitting in, he just used this illustration offhand, and I've never forgotten it. And it's a goofy story, and that's probably why he's never put it in any of his books. But I gravitate to the goofy stories, But the story was one about a man who gets into an argument with his wife because he really blew it, and he was all wrong, she was totally right, which it's an embellished story right there, right? So, anyway, he was totally in the wrong, but he was so upset, so mad that the last thing you want to do is admit that you're wrong, right? When confronted with it and everything. So he goes out the front door, just slams the door, hops in his car, and he speeds down the road. I mean, because he's just fuming and he's not thinking about driving. He's just mad, right? Runs right through red light, right into the side of a cement truck. Okay. He's in trouble. He's in trouble because he is so hurt that well, let's go ahead and say he dies for a few seconds there, because I'd say that's some pretty bad trouble. Mm-hmm. But you know what? He's also in legal trouble because he ran the red light. He was speeding. So he's got a legal problem and he's got a health problem. But let's say this took place in a little community where the emergency room doctor is also the judge. I told you it was a weird story. And so on the operating table, they bring him in the next few seconds because he's right there in front of I don't know. Anyway, they bring him in. And on the operating table, when he brings him back to life, he's taking care of the sickness problem because now he's alive. However, he's not going to be fully recuperated for a long time. So he's from death to life, but it's going to be a process. And at the same time, the judge decides to forgive him for running the red light. So you see, he had a legal problem. He also had a health problem. But there's one person who was able to take care of the legal problem and forgive him, and also bring him back to life and start the process of him getting better, right? And I know this is a goofy story, but this is the reason I so like this story. When the guy finally goes back home, he doesn't just go back home, he brings a dozen roses. Why? Because his wife's upset because slammed the door and all that other stuff.
Because she's allergic to roses.
Say what?
She's allergic to roses.
No, she loves the roses. When he was forgiven by the judge, he was justified. When he was brought from death to life, he was sanctified instantaneously, the one-time process. He started the healing process. That's the ongoing sanctification. And the flowers he brought back home turned away wrath. That's propitiation. So there's one goofy story that gets a whole bunch of these biblical terms. And you know what? It's goofy enough. I bet you're going to remember that. So I remembered that. Did I miss a hand here? Was there a hand?
Mark,
Yes.
can I read 2 Peter 3?
Please.
It might pertain. God's divine power has given us everything we need for living a godly life.
Yes.
Do you think that?
Yes. Yes. Because that's definitely on the sanctification process and as far as living the way we ought to live. But he's also taking care of the problem of sin. And specifically when he's talking here about his role as priest, Dr. Cottrell used to put it this way: we've got double trouble and God's got a double cure. It's not just a legal problem, it's a sin-corrupting problem. And God's got both justification and sanctification for us. In that, he offers that through Jesus Christ. Verse 26, it says, he was this kind of priest. He was the kind of priest that we need. Literally, and I'm going to bet that some of your translations, because you've got good translations, literally it says fitting. Fitting. It's like hand in glove. He's the kind of priest that you and I need because he is holy, not hagios, the typical word for holy. The typical word for holy emphasizes the idea of separation. And this word emphasizes the idea of character a little bit more. It's a variation of the word, but it emphasizes, instead of just being different, it emphasizes good moral character. And it emphasizes that aspect of it. So he's fitting in because he's holy and blameless, meaning totally innocent, absence of evil, unstained by sin, pure or undefiled. He has been set apart from sinners and has been given the highest place of honor in heaven because of his accomplishment and what he sacrificed. Verse 27, unlike those other high priests, he does not need to offer sacrifices every day. This is interesting because the high priest didn't offer sacrifices every day. There were morning and evening sacrifices. The high priest, as far as the sin sacrifice, was only offered once a year on the Day of Atonement, right? And he's also going to emphasize a little bit later on, he had to do this for himself as well as for the people. But the point he's making here is, even though he only did it once a day, he needed it every day. He's sinning all the time. And his point is, Jesus didn't need that at all. They did this for their own sins first, then for the sins of the people. But Jesus did this once for all. Okay, he's emphasizing it again. He's really going to emphasize it in a couple more chapters when he offered himself as a sacrifice for the people's sins. The law, talking about the Old Covenant, appointed high priests who were limited by human weakness. Human weakness. All the frailty, all the sinfulness that comes along with this. But after the law was given, so it's not superseded by the law. This comes after, right? After the law was given, God appointed his Son with a guarantee, with an oath. See how he's summarizing everything he's said in the last few verses? And his Son has been made perfect through suffering, perfect through in that he brings people to God. The perfect high priest. He's combining Psalm 110 with Psalm 2 here when he talks about the Son and the oath and bringing it all together. I think a beautiful way of summarizing what he's just said there. Any questions or comments? This is a good place to break. In chapter 8, we're going to be getting into again, he's still going to be talking about the priesthood, and he's still going to be talking about the law. And he's going to specifically go into the tabernacle and what happens there, and then he's going to get into one of my favorite Old Testament passages, Jeremiah chapter 31. Yes.
I've been asking a lot of questions. And
I'm glad.
this one doesn't necessarily, it's not like directly pertaining to it, but the book of Psalms,
Yes.
in a very, like I want to know like its purpose, really. I know there's a lot of things to get out of it, a lot of different things to get out of it.
Yes.
And I know that like, I've heard some people say like, that we let these psalms become our own prayers and stuff like that, and I'm like, I'm not sure if that's what we're supposed to do, but
Oh, they can be. In fact, that's a very good use
yeah.
of psalms, because psalms were literally used in praise and worship of God. A lot of them, in the directions they said, are meant to be used with musical accompaniment.
Right.
So this is like the song book, the Old Testament. But technically, if you refer to the book of Psalms, you really ought to say the books
The books.
of Psalms,
Huh.
because there's 150 Psalms. But you know how many books there are in Psalms? There's 5. There's 5 books of the Psalms because they were collected at different. Psalms were not written at one clump. Not one clump. That's a technical term.
During one time.
One clump of time, yeah.
Yeah.
So it's a collection of songs.
Yes, there were different
And there's 5 albums.
time periods
Yeah.
when they were collected, and most of the Psalms, of course, are written by David. But there's 7 different authors of the Psalms.
Yeah.
Moses even has a psalm.
Oh yeah.
It's one of my favorite ones, in fact. Yeah.
I guess I don't know what I'm really looking for, but I guess in the Psalms sometimes, like when I'm reading another book,
Yeah.
I know the context pretty well, like subconsciously, so it's like pretty easy for me to, generally easy for me to follow along. But with the Psalms, it's kind of like I'm afraid that like a prophecy is gonna pop up out of nowhere, and I'm not gonna.
You're not gonna
what
catch it?
is, and how am I supposed to take that? You know what I'm saying?
It is a different style of writing. That's very true. Which is part of the beauty of the Bible, because there are times when we need just to read a story. We need to hear this. How was this lived out in David's life, or how did Paul live this out? Other times we need commandments. We need directives. But there are other times when we need it, like in the Psalms, in poetry, and expressed through song, things like that. And especially in times of grief, in times of sometimes in times of personal devotion. That's why I really like the idea of praying some of the Psalms, because there are all sorts of. There's Psalms you can pray when you want to praise God. There's Psalms that you can pray when your heart's broken, and you feel like you've got no hope. You just get the whole sweep in Psalms as far as our relationship with God and how to express that relationship. So it's a beautiful book, and it is different because it is poetry, but it's true nonetheless. Yes.
Thank you.
Well,
Sure.
one thing I noticed in reading the Psalms in context through the chronological Bible
Yes.
helped a lot, because we were reading the Psalms as we were reading history.
That is
So
very neat,
was,
isn't it?
Yeah, it was very helpful. It's the first time I ever read the Psalms, and because they were in context with what I just was reading about David, or about the nation after it was going to be or was
Yes.
in exile, because there's Psalms even that go into the exile time.
Yes.
You get a better feel for what, now it makes sense to me, when
Yes.
I'm reading, and
Yes.
instead of just reading the Psalms as a book, like we do usually.
And frequently, there are a number of Psalms where at the very heading, which is part of the Psalm itself, it's not written in by the translators, it'll say when David feigned
Yeah.
insanity or whatever, and it'll have the Psalm there, or when at the time when
When
Absalom
Naaman-
rebelled.
Yeah, or
There'll be different historical markers as to when it's, which to me really makes it come alive too, different periods of life. Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
I got a question. Back to Hebrews, because there's so many people, especially in America today, who are teaching this Israel theology or whatever. Do you have any idea how they get through the book of Hebrews?
Oh,
and
boy.
how they teach it?
Hmm.
I'm just thinking it's
Probably
not.
skip
I understand if you're just going to twist something to make it work, but it seems like you have to go exact opposite to what Hebrews keeps saying. So do you know how they get away with that?
No, and I'm mindful of, when I ask so many different questions in Bible college, I remember my professors saying, don't ask me to defend them, because it's not fair for me to ask you to ask me to defend somebody I don't agree with.
Yeah.
Because you know what I'm saying.
Yeah.
However, I'm sure there's a lot I have not read. But every time I've tried to read articles and books to try to understand. And so I don't want you to think I'm just going to sling mud, because this is going to sound like mudslinging. But Dr. Roger Chambers, one of my other professors, used to say that this view is a scissors and paste view of Scripture. And what he meant by that is you can come away with the idea that the Jews today have a special status with God and they're an exemption and everything. But the only way you can do that is if you take this verse out here, you cut it out, and then you take this verse out here, you cut it out. And there are verses, and you put them all together and you get it. And I just hesitate to tell you guys this, but I just got another email last week, and it was a 45-page email.
Whoa.
And every time, it's because somebody wrote a book, and people in the church think, well, I'm just going to give this to my preacher, so he'll tell me what it says. And so it's part of what I get paid for. So I'm saying this because please don't do that unless you really, really need. Anyway, this guy quoted scriptures right and left, and he wanted me to answer. And so I wrote back to Jimmy, and I said, Jimmy, for me to answer this, I'm going to have to write 90 pages. Because the guy quotes a ton of scriptures, but every time he quotes a scripture, he just, this verse and that verse and this verse. You look at this verse in the whole chapter and what he's really talking about, and do it in context. And you'll never come away with that conclusion. And I firmly believe, that's why I'm glad we're going through this book of Hebrews, because he's not just saying it's possible to lose your salvation. He's man, is he making this huge statement about it's only Jesus, and anything else, even the old covenant, all is that, as wonderful as it was. You give up on Jesus, you've lost it. Yeah, I'm sorry, that's not really an answer, but it is an answer from my perspective. Because, again, I'll freely admit, I haven't read everything. I don't have time nor the inclination to read all that stuff. But when serious stuff comes out, I have tried to sit down and go through some of this stuff. And it just, I guess it was 2 weeks ago now with, maybe 3, with this one from Jimmy. It was the same point. Because this guy wrote this 45-page or 50-page, whatever it was, to say that Paul did not preach the same gospel that is presented in the New Testament. The rest of the New Testament, there's the gospel of the kingdom, and then there's the gospel of grace. And he makes a distinction in Acts chapter 8, and he says that's when everything changed. And I'm just shaking my head. I think to myself, if you want a distinction between the old and new, go to the book that talks about it, the book of Hebrews, and it clearly makes a distinction of when the old stopped and when the new started. And any other place you have to read it in there. But this is the one book will actually say, and he's building up to it in chapter 9, he's going to say, here's when it stopped, and this is when the new covenant went in. And the Bible itself will define those lines for us. Okay, we are way over time. So I'm gonna pick on the guy who talked the most tonight. I'm going to ask him if he would. Chris, would you have our prayer of dismissal for us tonight, please?